Hello again. My name's Dan. I'm part of this Freedom Church of the Poor family, and I'm always so glad to be here in community and in worship with you all and in study too, because I can't help myself. Um, and so speaking of, I love Amos a lot. I think it's hard to fully appreciate Amos unless we know who he is a little bit. And so as always, just like stop me if you all already know all of this. I feel like my utter lack of like formal theological training means I never have any idea what everybody already knows. But so Amos was a shepherd and a fig harvester. He was an agricultural worker. In fact, during his ministry, during his prophesying, he is asked by one of the official priests, to stop being a prophet, and to stop saying these things, to stop, communicating God's judgment on this unjust society. And he responds by saying, "But I'm not a prophet. I'm a tender of flocks and a harvester of sycamore figs, and God called me away from my flock to come and share this news with you all." Um, so he's deeply in touch with the life of the poor and the dispossessed of his own time. Those were his people. That's where he came from. That's the voice that he spoke with. And he shared this prophecy at a time that, like in that Frederick Douglass speech, when wickedness and injustice appeared at its most invincible. This was the high point of the northern kingdom of Israel in, say, like 780s to 750s BCE. So a very long time ago. They had won these amazing military victories. There was this immense wealth being accumulated. The ruling class of the time was making tons of money, trading, you know, uh, oils and agricultural goods and all kinds of things like that, and making a huge amount of wealth that was being piled up for them. But what Amos points out is that all of that was based on exploitation, that the flip side of all of that wealth at that time was poverty and dispossession and indebtedness and forced labor. That was the base, and that was the outcome of all of this wealth that was being piled up. And he said, this is not only is this not right, but this is unsustainable, that we are headed for crisis, that this system might appear invincible at this moment, but it's actually never been closer to its downfall. And so in all of this, one of the reasons I love Amos is he is an uncompromising prophet of doom. There is almost nothing of redemption in this whole book, as short as it is. There's like a little chapter tacked on at the end that seems like a much later addition, and even that kind of feels half-hearted. And then there's like one line that says, if you hate evil and love good, if you establish justice in the courts, then maybe God will be gracious towards you. And that's the extent of the hope for redemption and being saved in Amos. He is not a hopeful prophet. He is not somebody promising that things can get back on track. He is a prophet saying that it is too late, that this has gone too far, that there is no saving this society in the direction that it's gone. All of the rest of it is condemnation and judgment and threats of violence and suffering and social breakdown. But I think it's important in that to think about who is Amos when he's talking and who is he talking to. And so again and again in this short book, Amos is very clear about who he's talking to, right? In chapter 8 that we just read, he says, "Listen to this, you who devour the needy, annihilating the poor of the land." And then earlier he says, "Listen, you who trample the heads of the poor into the dust of the ground and make the humble walk a twisted course. You who are reclining by altars in garments that you stole from the poor because you foreclosed on their clothing, because you gave them some money to survive, and you ended up taking their clothing because they couldn't pay off their loan. You who are drinking in God's house with wine that you bought with the money that you extracted and exploited out of the poor." So that's who he's talking to. Earlier, he says, "You who defraud the poor who rob the needy." He says, "You who impose a tax on the poor," a tax that's the result of, or that's another way of extracting labor from people. It's not an income tax, right? This is a tax on poor communities. That's a way for the wealthy to accumulate more wealth and more power. You who are building these beautiful houses, and you who are building these vineyards that are the result of combining properties together because you've been foreclosing on the poor. Who he's talking to is, he says, "You who are at ease in Zion, you who are at ease in Jerusalem, and you who are confident on the hill of Samaria in the northern kingdom, you notables of this nation on whom the house of Israel pins their hopes. He's talking to the people who are lying on ivory beds and lolling in their couches and feasting on lambs and calves, right? He says, you who are anointing yourself with the choicest oils, you who are happy with these military victories and claim that it's by your own might that you have captured these cities. So if you aren't one of those people doing one of those things, then Amos is not talking to you. You're not the person that Amos is pronouncing doom upon, right? Instead, Amos is you, right? If you're not one of the people who is defrauding the poor and grinding the face of the poor into dust, then Amos is not pronouncing doom on you. I think we get turned around with these prophets of doom and think that they're talking to us as the readers. We think that they're talking to just the whole society. But Amos is very clear about who he's talking about, and who he's talking from is from us and our communities. That's the voice that he's speaking with. That's who he's speaking on behalf of. So I think it's important to get that straight at the beginning. And Amos is not then in this a prophet of hope in the way that we normally think about it. He's not a prophet of redemption. He doesn't promise redemption, but he is a prophet of good news to the poor, right? Good news to the poor is that injustice can't last forever. If we take seriously the song in the beginning, this idea that we have nothing to lose but our chains, or if we take seriously this idea that this system will appear invincible right up until the moment of its downfall, right? What we're saying is that oppression will collapse under its own weight, under the weight of its own injustice. Earlier in Amos, there's this really beautiful line where he says, you rulers of this sick society, I will slow your movements as a wagon is slowed when it is full of cut grain, right? It is the very wealth that you have piled up and accumulated that's going to be your undoing. And so Amos isn't a prophet of hope in the way that I think we normally think about it, but he's a prophet of Jubilee, because he's a prophet who says that there comes a moment when the poor can push this broken society over the edge of a cliff, right? And clear out some room to do something new, to live in the way that's described in some of the other parts of the Bible that were laid out in the season statement, right? So we talk about Jubilee as an anti-poverty program. Amos's anti-poverty program is to get rid of the people who have their feet on the necks of the poor. That is Amos's anti-poverty program, to overthrow that, to get rid of it, to clear it out. And so in that, Amos doesn't promise in this chapter we're looking at, right? Doesn't promise that God is going to come and save the day and punish the wicked and lift up the righteous. What Amos promises us, what Amos gives us, is the knowledge and the confidence that God sees every single crime of the wealthy and the powerful, that God despises their hypocrisy, their false piety, their oppression, and their violence against the poor. But when Amos talks about the day of the Lord, the day when God breaks into history and moves with us, that day isn't a new dawn. It's the end. It's the hour of doom. It's darkness, right? What Amos says is, he says, you who wish for the day of God, why should you want the day of God, right? He's talking to this hypocritical ruling elite of priests and generals and landlords and kings who go into their synagogue, go into their place of worship and say, we can't wait until the day that God comes, right? And Amos is saying, you don't want God to come because that is a day of darkness for you. Amos says, spare me the sound of your hymns and let me not hear the music of your lutes, but let justice well up like water and righteousness like an unfailing stream, right? When that famous line that Dr. King and others have taken up comes right in this moment, when Amos is saying, you ruling class, you do not want the day of the Lord. I promise you, because that is not a good day for you. And so there, and then also returning to chapter 8, Amos is very clear that we can't separate the spiritual element of things, the worship of things, right, from the way that we live together. So in this chapter, these landlords, these merchants, they say they hate the Sabbath. They can't wait for the Sabbath to be over. This is, in Jewish tradition, God's greatest gift to us is the Sabbath, right? Is Shabbat, is this day of ceasing and of resting. And Amos is saying that these people, they hate the Sabbath, right? They have rejected God's gift because it's a day, one day out of the week when they can't exploit the poor, right? When they can't overcharge people and underpay them, when they can't make predatory loans and foreclose on people's homes and on their bodies. They can't wait for these days of rest to be over. And so God says, I won't forget any of this. God says, I see it all. And then, so what God tells us is that the earth itself is going to tremble with God's outrage. God says, do you remember how the Nile rose up and swallowed Pharaoh's army? Do you remember that? Obviously, you don't remember it. It doesn't seem like you remember it because of the way you've been acting and treating and enslaving people. Well, the earth itself is going to swallow you. And so then what God says to us is, what are you going to do about it? So this isn't a hopeful message in the way that we normally think about it. But from my tradition, this is how my God helps, right? This is how my God creates an opening, right? God tells us how to live together. Earlier in Amos, it says, behold, the one who formed the mountains and created the wind and whose wishes have been made known to mortals. God has been very clear about how God wants us to live together. And God brings crisis and destruction against the organizers of injustice. And then my God asks us, what are you going to do now? And we're the ones who have to answer. It reminds me of speaking of the Exodus tradition, which it always has to come back to the Exodus tradition. When the Israelites got to the Red Sea as they were fleeing Pharaoh's kingdom and bondage and enslavement, Moses tells them, and they're freaked out because they're trapped. They've got the sea right here, and they've got Pharaoh's army right here, and they're in the middle, and they have nowhere else to go. And they start crying out to Moses, and Moses says, stand back. God is going to handle this. And what does God say to Moses? God doesn't say, yes, you're right. I got this. Hold on. God says, why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move forward. Right? God taught the Israelites how to survive the plagues. God brought plagues and crisis to Pharaoh's empire. But in the critical moment, it was human beings who had to get together and move across the Red Sea and move into something new, right? And so today, this country is in crisis. It is an ugly time. It is a time of darkness, and it is ugliest of all for the poor, right? This is not a light time. And that's how God talks in times like these. Right. And so if we think about the lessons for us today, what does Amos tell us today? It's that the reality is that neither Trump and the Republicans nor the Democratic Party have any way to stabilize the situation today. Right. Amos doesn't promise that there is a way to stabilize the situation. Amos doesn't promise that there is a way to save that society. Right? No sections of our ruling elite today have any way to stabilize the situation. The injustice that's taken root is too deep, and their vision is too shallow. But the good news of Amos is that the darkness that we're living in today isn't just the darkness of injustice, which we have known for years and for decades and centuries. It's the darkness of a ruling class that has no idea what to do next, but to double down on the same injustices that brought them into the crisis. So this is a moment when God is coming into history, right? This is a Kairos moment. This is God's responsibility in a time of social transformation and change, right? As God's judgment. Amos says that there is no redemption for a society as sick and as far off the path of God's teaching as ours is. And I say that too is good news, right? That is an opening. That is a time when change is actually possible. And so our task, our job, is to find ways of getting together, finding new ways to protect each other and surviving this crisis as it gets deeper, as it gets darker, and to find ways to work with God to push this broken and sick society over the edge of the cliff, right? Our job, as God brings us between a rock and a hard place, as God brings us between Pharaoh's army and the sea, as God brings us to a point of no return in the need to do something fundamentally different with our life together, is to get organized and take the lead to cross the sea together. So I guess I would just end by saying I think when we look at Amos, it's a curious choice here for the season of Jubilee, right? Amos's single and sole anti-poverty program, again, is to get rid of the people who have their feet on the necks of the poor. And so I think that's an important lesson for us of what does it take to actually clear out the room and the space to carry out a Jubilee program for the world that we want to build and live in together. And how do we work with God to clear out that space by getting rid of this ruling elite that refuses to allow us to live with God in the way that God has taught us to. So